Welcome to a very special Foster the City themed church service today. We'll get started in just a few minutes, but first let's open our hearts to what God has for us today with some great music. Hey there, welcome to church. I'm so glad that you're here, and I really think that today is going to be exactly what you need. Now here at Cornerstone, we set out to follow a set of values, a set of principles that guide us as Christians as we try to pull the kingdom of God to earth. Values like asking, what does love require in every situation? Or we live life on mission with each other to restore all things. Also, we try to share any advantage we have with those who are less advantaged. And I love this one, we include everyone, especially those not like us. Now, there's one particular thing we do around here as a church that kind of intersects and overlaps with almost each one of these values. The way we minister to people, to kids in the foster system. So, with me here today, sitting here quietly waiting till I'm done rambling, is the amazing, the talented Erin McGrath. She oversees actually the relationship between Cornerstone Fellowship and an organization we're going to talk about today called Foster the City, which is originated right here in the Bay Area and now all over the West Coast. So Erin, tell us a little bit about Foster the City. You don't work for them, you work for Cornerstone, but what's your, what do you know about them?
Yeah, we believe so much in the mission that they are pursuing. We even support them financially as a church, which I value so much. But Foster the City, what it is an organization that they believe there's a church for every child in foster care. And so kids are in foster care because of abuse or neglect. And really, as we know, you can't have healing unless you're really in a loving environment. And so Foster the City's mission is to solve, I don't know if that's a great word, but provide an opportunity for each of these kids in foster care to be in a loving home environment through the church. And then for there to be this beautiful support system where it's not just the foster family that's embracing and loving and supporting the kid that's in foster care, but also they have this thing called support friends where like 4 or 5 peoples or families will wrap around that foster family. And it's this beautiful picture of community, this beautiful picture of a larger, maybe a small church, image where there's this larger netting of people that are walking with this kid. And there's so much that goes on with foster care. And so it's just a beautiful way to be a part of. How do we love these kids and provide a loving environment for them? And so I, of course, love that.
Yeah, why specifically do you get super passionate? I can see it now. You're very passionate about this. Where does your life connect with this particular mission?
Yeah, actually, I got involved because of Foster the City, where they, as they shared with us that there's kids that are in foster care. There's far more kids in need of homes than there are homes. And so I became a foster parent about 3 years ago. And so for the last 3 years, I've had...
Easy job.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard and good. Okay. It's beautiful. It's hard and good. But, and so I had 16-year-olds. I had teenage girls. So that was my heart in my home. And so I could not have done it without the model that Foster the City provides. And so if it were me on my own, there were things that I walked, it was just hard. And so I loved the image and loved the structure of, I always knew there were other people that were walking through this with me. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because as a foster parent, I was like, I don't need the support, right? Like financially, I didn't need someone to like drop off meals, and the support friends, they do things in tangible ways of dropping off meals or watching the kids or helping with rides or, dropping off diapers, whatever. I was like, I don't really need those resources. We're okay. And yet I had a support friend who she bought dinner for one of my kiddos every week. And it's usually once a month that there's this support, from each person. There's 4 or 5. But unusually, she decided every week. And my kiddo was just like, why does she do this? I don't know her. I've never met her. Like, why does she just want to buy me dinner every week? And it was this joyful interaction of she doesn't know me, but she cares about me. There's no way for my kid to repay that or earn anything with her. It was just, she just loves you because you were made. And so what a gift. Way more than just me providing dinner every week for my kiddo, right? It was such a much more impactful way to love her. And so I'm super thankful for Foster the City and for the structure that they provide, but also the heart behind their mission of just wanting to provide a home for every child.
Well, you definitely made the case for why we want to spend an entire hour talking about this as a church. What could if people feel prompted, motivated throughout this message coming up? What do you think could be a good first step for them?
Yes, so Foster the City puts on what they call an interest meeting, and it is a great, it's not a commitment. You're not committing. You're not saying, okay, I'm going to sign up to be a foster family. You're not saying, committing to anything, but it's a great. If I have questions about how I can be involved or what I can do, or I just want to learn more, we have two options for you. We're doing an interest meeting here on campus at Livermore on a Thursday, November 30th. From 6:30 to 8. Foster the City also has a virtual option, and it's offered just about every month. And so check out the website that's here on the screen, and for more information on that. And
That's awesome. Excellent. Well, we'll put the information right here on the screen, and like Aaron said, and then we'll put it in the description in the message notes. Please open up your ears, but also your heart today, as perhaps the Lord will motivate you and prompt you to take action. As you hear right now from Philip Pattison from Foster the City. Welcome to Cornerstone Fellowship.
Hey, Cornerstone Fellowship. My name is Philip. I'm with Foster the City. Foster the City is a movement of churches, just like Cornerstone Fellowship, that are working together to provide loving homes for kids that are coming into foster care. I am so stoked to be with you today to have a conversation about something that I think is really near to the heart of God. And because it's near to the heart of God, it's near to the heart of this church. Today, I want to talk about the remarkable compassion of God. Okay, I want to take just a long, lingering look at the remarkable compassion of God and the remarkable compassion that He's calling you and me into. And just so we're on the same page right out the gate, let me tell you what I mean when I say that. Okay, if you look at that word compassion, you have calm, C-O-M, and then you have passion, right? Passion, we know, means to suffer, like the passion of the Christ. And calm, C-O-M, like community or communal, it means with. So compassion means to suffer with, to stand with those who are suffering, to be near to those who are suffering, to be near to those who are in need. And as I said, this is something that's incredibly near to the heart of God, isn't it? You know, when you open up the scriptures, it is crystal clear. He loves every man, woman, and child, right? In the Bay Area, across this planet, He loves every man, woman, and child. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, right? That He wishes that none would perish, but that all would come to eternal life. He loves everybody, and yet it's also clear, when you open up the scriptures, there are some people that have a special place in His heart. There are some people that make the top of God's list. It's the orphan. It's the widow, it's the poor, and it's the immigrant. You see it all throughout the Bible. Genesis to Revelations, Old Testament, New Testament. It's those who are far from home. It's those who are without family. It's those who have suffered deep loss, who are without protection, who are vulnerable. They have a special place in the heart of God. I could take you so many places throughout scriptures, but really it's from the beginning to the end. You see it all the way in the very beginning in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. You see in Deuteronomy 15, it says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. It's in the Torah. It's in the Psalms. Defend the weak and the fatherless, the psalmist says. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. It's in the wisdom books. Proverbs 19, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and He will repay him for his deed. It's in the prophets. Isaiah 58, is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? It goes right on into the New Testament, right from the mouth of Jesus. Jesus says, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. And it goes on into the New Testament letters. James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. I could keep going and going and going. Here's my point. All throughout the scriptures, it is crystal clear what God's heart is towards the vulnerable. And because remarkable compassion is a defining characteristic of our God, remarkable compassion has been a defining characteristic of God's people since the beginning of the church. Last 2,000 years throughout church history, it is so crystal clear that the way that remarkable compassion has worked itself out of God's people. There's a lot you could say about the church over the last 2,000 years, some positive, some not so much. But one thing that is undeniable, over the last 2,000 years, time and again, God's people have moved towards places and systems of brokenness and injustice, and we have brought healing and hope. That is what God's people do. Countless examples. In fact, did you know that the first known hospital in every nation across the globe was started by the church? Isn't that cool? If you look at education reform and prison reform and women's rights and the abolition of slavery and civil rights, of course, they all trace their roots back to the Christian movement. This is what we do. The same is true with foster care. Let me tell you about a guy named Charles Brace. Charles Loring Brace was his name. Back in the 1800s, was born in the northeastern part of the U.S. He was part of a Christian home. When he was young, he placed his faith in Jesus. And one day he was sitting in church Sunday morning, listening to a message from his pastor. And the pastor said something that would become this kind of defining moment in his life. I'm going to paraphrase here, so bear with me, but this is basically what the pastor said. The pastor said, you know, when we stop to remember all that God has done for us in our times of need, when we stop to remember all the times that God has met us with compassion when we were in need, it's impossible when we see those in need around us now to believe that we don't have at least some level of responsibility to do something. I kind of butchered that. Let me say that one more time. This is what the pastor said. When we stop to remember all that God has done for us in our need, now when we see those in need around us, it's impossible for us to believe we don't have some level of responsibility to do something. That made sense to Charles. So a few years would go by. He'd be in New York City. He was studying to become a pastor. He was in seminary. And one day went for a walk through the streets of New York. And he walked into this neighborhood called 5 Points. 5 Points at the time was known for its crime and its poverty and its prostitution and its gang violence. And he said that he walked into that neighborhood and his heart just broke. His heart melted. Because what he saw in front of him were a bunch of children, a bunch of kids, living in these really broken, unhealthy environments. And when he walked into that neighborhood and he saw what he saw that day, his mind went back to what his pastor had said those years before, and he realized, in light of all the ways that God has met me in my need, I have to do something with what I'm seeing in front of me. I have to. And so he did. He got some of his buddies together at the age of 27, and they started what they called the Children's Aid Society, which, by the way, is still going on today, 150 years later. And the Children's Aid Society started all kinds of programs that dealt like at a root systemic level with what they were seeing in these neighborhoods in New York. So, for example, they started the first ever free school lunch program. They started the first free dental clinics for kids in the area. They started schools for kids who were disabled. They started the first ever Parent-Teacher Association. PTA came from the Children's Aid. If you've been a part of the PTA, you can blame Charles Brace. But most notably, they started what we call here in America foster care. So they would help these kids who were living in these really broken, unhealthy environments find a stable home to live in while their biological family took the necessary steps to create a healthy environment, and then the families were restored back together. What morphed and evolved from there became what we call in America foster care. Like, I'm gonna make sure you're following me here. Foster care was started by a pastor. It was started by a Christian with the motivation that in light of all that God has done for us, like surely we can do the same for those who are in front of us. Surely we can move towards the vulnerable that are right in our own backyards. But the reality is, honestly, the church moving towards vulnerable kids has a much longer, even richer history than that. We actually have historical records that tell us about an early kind of Roman tradition, Greco-Roman tradition. When a child would be born into a family, they would often do this ritual, this tradition. They would take the baby and they would place the baby down at the feet of its father. And if the father stooped down and picked up the child in his arms, the child was legitimized, celebrated. The place would go wild. The child would be welcomed, celebrated, legitimized into that family. It's beautiful. By the way, that's where we get the term raising our kids, is from that tradition. The problem is sometimes the dad didn't bend down and pick up the child. Maybe the child looked sick or frail. Maybe the child wasn't the preferred gender of that day. If for whatever reason the dad didn't bend down and pick up the child, instead what they would do is they would take the child outside of the city. It would be left alone to die. By the way, that was a completely common, legal, acceptable practice at the time. They called it infant exposure. But we also have historical records that tell us how early followers of Jesus responded to that, what the early church did. We're told that at night, the early church would go outside of the city and they would walk up and down the streets listening for the cries of children. And when they'd find these kids, they'd bring them back into their own homes and they would raise them up as their own beloved sons and daughters. Guys, this is what we do. This is the legacy of the church. Like, this is the history of God's people. This is who we are. Why I'm so stoked to be a part of Cornerstone Fellowship today is because, like, that wasn't just meant to be indicative and defining of who the church once was. That's meant to be who we are today. We have the opportunity to carry on that same torch in our generation right here in the Bay Area. The difference, though, is that you and I don't have to walk up and down the streets listening for the cries of children to know who needs help. The state of California has told us where we can find them. But it's about 8-9 years ago that my wife and I started fostering. And we started welcoming in these kids. And if you're not that familiar with foster care, sometimes a kid has to be removed from their biological family for maybe some traumatic situation. Maybe it's neglect or it's abuse, some kind of trauma. It's just not a safe environment anymore. And so a child's removed. And so these kids that were coming into our home were just breaking our hearts. We're getting to know them, getting to know their families, breaking our hearts. I was a pastor of a church at that time. Small little church here in the Bay Area. And so as our hearts are breaking for these kids, there was one morning years ago, we just stood in front of the little congregation and we said, what if as a whole church, we found some ways that we could move towards these kids and their families in crisis? So we kind of came up with some ways as a congregation that we would try to do that. And as we took steps towards these kids and their families, we began to build relationships with social workers. And at one point, a social worker sat down with me and she said, Philip, hey, this is great. We like working with your church. She said, but the reality is right now, in the Bay Area, we're in an emergency crisis. That was the phrase she used. She said, we are in an emergency crisis. And she said, this crisis honestly is just bigger than your church. She said, do you think that there are other churches out there that would want to come and link arms with you? She said, the reality is there are more children entering into foster care today than there are homes that are ready to receive them and help them in their time of need. She said, do you think that there are churches that would come alongside and work together to help us flip that crisis upside down? And guys, it has been one of the greatest gifts of my life, one of the greatest joys of my life, watching the way churches like Cornerstone Fellowship have responded to that invitation from that social worker. What started with one little congregation meeting in a senior center here in the Bay Area is today 276 churches working together to raise up foster families, to raise up support for foster families, and we're going to keep doing it until there's more than enough to meet the need. Our vision is that one day there'd be a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of kids in need of a home. And my hope and prayer is that some of you might be a part of that. Now, I want to kind of take the remaining bit of our time together today to actually share with you some of the reasons why I think we're seeing churches like Cornerstone Fellowship, why we're seeing so many families step forward, why we've seen so many hundreds of kids now welcomed into loving Foster the City homes. I want to tell you why I think we're seeing so many step forward and say yes. There's three things, three reasons why I believe people are moving forward and saying yes. Before I do that, can I just make one quick comment? foster care is not for everybody. Can I just say this? You can breathe a little bit wherever you are right now. You can just take a breath. Foster care is not for everybody. But listen, if you are a follower of Jesus, remarkable compassion is for you. That's not actually up for debate. Okay, that's part of what it means to follow Jesus. Jesus lived a life of remarkable compassion. And so we follow in his footsteps, don't we? But foster care is only one expression of remarkable compassion. There are countless expressions of compassion. But I do believe that what I'm about to share with you, these three reasons why people are moving forward, even if foster care is not even on your radar, I do think these three things I'm about to share with you can still help to be a foundation and a motivator for you in your life of compassion, whatever expression that might be. So here's the first reason why I think we're seeing families step forward, why we're seeing churches step forward. It's because we know that every person has intrinsic value. Every person has intrinsic value. Now, I know at Cornerstone Fellowship, there's a lot of young families. So let me take a minute, if I could, and just speak to some of you moms and dads out there. We've learned a lot over the recent years about what happens in the heart and in the mind of a child from the very earliest age. Neuroscientists call this attachment theory. There are things that are firing off and that a child is learning from the very earliest of ages. So for example, moms and dads, listen in. When your child cries, when you have a baby that cries and reaches out in need, and mom, dad, caregiver, when you come and you meet that child in her need, you pick her up, you bring warmth, you feed her, you rock her back to sleep, you meet her in that need. We're learning that there are some things that are firing off in that child's brain. There's some things that are being affirmed for that child. You know what they are? That child is learning, I'm loved, I'm valuable, I matter, and there is someone outside of me that I can trust. That's what's being affirmed for that child when you meet them in their need. On the flip side, of course, when a child cries and their need is maybe not met, they reach out for help and nobody meets them in their need. Or maybe that when they reach out for help, it's met with frustration or anger. Instead, we're learning that there are some things that are firing off in their brain, and it's that I must not be loved, I must not matter, and I can't trust anybody besides myself. Guys, it has been, over the last 8 years, one of the greatest joys of my life, watching family after family after family, including families right here at Cornerstone Fellowship, that have moved towards kids and daily met them in their needs and are reaffirming to them what is true about who they are. You are loved, you matter, and there is someone outside of you that you can trust, and ultimately there is a God that you can trust. We know in the book of Genesis says that we were created in the image of God. We are image bearers, every one of us. Every one of you watching today, listening today, you are an image bearer of God. You matter. The book of Isaiah says that you are precious to God in his sight. You matter. Ephesians 1, Paul says that God spoke us forth from before the foundation of the world. He spoke you forth from before the foundation of the world. Stop and think about that for a minute. That means that moment when your mom and your dad came together and you were conceived. I know it's gross to think about. Hang with me for just a minute. That moment when your mom and your dad came together and you were put into being. If Ephesians 1 is true, then that moment of conception is second in your story. What came first was that you were birthed in the heart of God before time and space began. You matter. Every man, woman, and child across the Bay Area and beyond matters to God. I have a buddy, he's a foster dad. His name is Krish. And he tells a story about one day getting a call for a kiddo that needed a foster home. And he already had kids in the home, so he was on the phone with the social worker, and he said, well, I've already got kids in my house right now. Can you tell me a little bit more about him before I say yes? I want to make sure he's going to be a good fit for our family. And the social worker on the other end of the line said, well, We don't know much about him. He's brand new to the system. We know one thing. We know he's a biter. And my buddy's like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is he biting? And he's like, I'm not sure I want to take in a biter. And he said, as soon as that thought hit him, all of his theology started flooding back into his mind. Truth started flooding back into his mind. And he said, I realized that the term biter is an incomplete description of a child. The term biter is an inadequate, incomplete description of a human being. You know why? Because you are more than the worst things that you've done. And you're more than the worst things that have been done to you. Friends, you matter to God. And again, set foster care aside for a minute. You might have just needed to log on and be watching this today just because you, right now, today, need to hear that one sentiment. So I'm going to say it one more time, and I want you to hear. You matter to God. You are more than the worst things you've done, and you're more than the worst things that have been done to you. You are valuable. I don't just say that because I read it in a book somewhere, or I sing it in a song. Like, God didn't just say that we matter. He proved it, didn't he? God proved his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He proved it. That brings me to my second point, the second reason why I believe so many churches and so many families are moving towards vulnerable in their community. And that's because we realize their story is our story. Right? Their story is my story. I may be a little bit biased here, but there may be no time in your life when you are more like God than in the moments when you open up your heart and your life to someone who's in need. Because that's exactly what he did for us, didn't he? There was a time in my life when I was hurting and struggling, and I felt alone, and my marriage was falling apart. And I thought that because of all of the wounds and the junk and all the scars from my past, that I had lost any hope for my future. And when I was at my lowest and my darkest place, God met me there. And he brought me into family. And he gave me hope for my future. Is that your story? There's a verse again in Ephesians chapter 1. It says, I think it's verse 4 and 5. It says, God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. I love that verse. That's one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. Listen, I don't know most of you. I don't know most of your stories. You might have jumped on here and you're watching this, maybe even a part of Cornerstone Fellowship for a long time. Maybe you're new. Maybe you're here just exploring faith, Christianity, Jesus. Is there really a God out there? Maybe in your time of seeking and exploring, you're even to this place where, man, even if there is a God out there, would he want someone like me? Maybe there is a God, but would he even want someone like me after all the things I've done, all the places that I've been, time and time again? Would he even want me? If that's you today, I beg you to hear what the scriptures say. That not only is he willing to welcome you into his family, he wants to. It says this is what he wanted to do, and it brought him great pleasure. It would bring God great pleasure and great joy to welcome you in as his daughter or as his son. I feel like as a foster dad, I feel like I've gotten a chance to just like have a tiny little like glimpse of what this is like, welcoming someone into your family. The kiddos that we've brought into our home have brought a tremendous amount of joy and laughter and unbelievable memories. The most recent little girl that we brought into our home, we brought her in when she was 2 months old, 2.5 months old. And we fostered her for about 4 years. Partway through her fostering journey, we were told that her case was going to be different than the kiddos we'd fostered in the past. The kids we'd fostered in the past had all gone back home to be with their families. That's the goal whenever possible. It's to see we've been given the ministry of reconciliation, is what the scriptures say. So we got to see families reconciled back together. We got to help support that. But for this little girl, that wasn't going to be possible. She wasn't going to have a home to go back to. And so the social workers and the judges and stuff, they said, hey, she's going to need another option for what they call permanency. And so after 4 years of fostering this little girl, we moved from being her foster family to her forever family. We got the chance to adopt her. And now she just turned 7. And for the last almost 7 years, it's like clockwork every morning. I have this chair in my family room where I do my quiet time. And so almost every morning she comes, waddles out in her little nightie. She comes waddles out of her room and into the family room, and she crawls up and she totally interrupts my quiet time every single morning. And I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. And it's mind-boggling to me that the way that I see my little girl as she comes towards me, and that the way that I love her and adore her, that God feels that kind of pleasure towards me as his son. Again, God was not just willing to welcome you into his family. He wants you. It would bring him great joy. But welcoming us into family didn't just come with pleasure, didn't just come with joy, did it? When God welcomed us into his family, it also required something else. It required sacrifice. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. That's what Hebrews says. There's joy, but there's also a cross. In the same way, when you and I show remarkable compassion towards others, there will always be a cost involved. You know, when people hear about Foster the City, or they hear that our family fosters, we often will get the same response from people. They'll say something like, man, that's so cool that you guys do that. That's amazing. I could never do that. That's what we hear over and over again. People say stuff like, man, isn't it hard? What if the kiddos that come into your home act out? What if there's behavior issues? You know, these kids are coming from maybe some hard places. They've experienced some difficult things. The reality is that can be the case. The reality is every one of us act out of the trauma that we've experienced. I act out of the hard things that I've experienced in my life. We all do. And the reality is, more often than not, these kiddos have experienced significantly harder things than you and I ever have. So will they act out? Sometimes. Sometimes that can be really hard. On the flip side, people will say, isn't it hard to let the kids go when they go back home? Like you foster them for months or maybe even years, and then just one day you get a call and a social worker comes and picks them up and takes them back to their family. Like, isn't that difficult? Don't you get attached? Do you want to know the answer to that? Yeah, it's hard. It rips your heart out every time. The first little girl that we brought into our home, we brought her in when she was 4 months old. Beautiful little girl. We very, very quickly fell in love with her. She very quickly became like a part of our family. We had her for about a year in our home. She took her first steps in my living room, in fact. Her first words were with us. She called me Dada. That was her first word. Very quickly became a sister to my biological kids. But as we were getting to know this little girl and falling in love with this little girl and watching her become like a part of our family, we were also getting to know her biological parents. And there was a reason why their daughter was with us. I mean, they had made some mistakes, but they were doing everything that they possibly could to bring their little girl back home. Everything they could to be able to welcome her back home. And so after about a year, the judge gave the green light, and he said, okay, it's time. And so I remember handing this little girl back into the arms of her father at my front door. My son, my oldest son at the time, he said it was the first time he'd ever seen me cry, because we wept that day. Of course it hurts. But we don't show compassion because it makes us feel good. Because compassion's not about you, and it's not about me. We have a friend, he says, you don't foster to get a child for your family, you foster to give your family for a child. You see the difference? And again, that's true with any expression of compassion. We don't show compassion to get something for ourselves, we show compassion to give ourselves to something. And if we are willing to do that, if we are willing to embrace the pleasure and the joy and the fun and the life, as well as the cost and the sacrifice, it's incredible to think about the impact that we can make. And that brings me to my kind of third and final core belief of why I believe people are moving towards vulnerable children at such an unprecedented way in the Bay Area. And that's because we're understanding that our investment in the lives of the vulnerable can bring long-term impact. Here's what I mean by that. Even if you have no experience in foster care, child welfare, you can probably guess kids who grow up without a stable, healthy environment are far more susceptible to all kinds of other issues as they grow older. So for example, if kids are not placed into a loving, stable home in foster care, about half will be unemployed in their 20s. A third will spend time on the streets. More than half will develop PTSD. You're actually twice as likely to develop PTSD as a child in foster care than a war veteran that's gone through active combat. Think about that for a minute. Let me just say that again. You are twice as likely to develop PTSD as a child in foster care than a war veteran that's been shot at. Suicidal tendencies for youth in foster care are 4 times higher than the average youth. The FBI did a study several years ago. They said that about 60%, that's 60, about 60% of kids that they were rescuing from human trafficking here in the States come directly from the foster care system. I could keep going and going and going with stats. Here's my point. Here's what we realized. We need churches like Cornerstone Fellowship and individuals and organizations to address people while they're dealing with those issues I just talked about. We need groups like IJM that are busting down doors and rescuing men and women who are being trafficked right now. We need people in the Tenderloin in San Francisco who are helping those who are homeless or who are unemployed. We need people, we need more of that. But what if in addition, we also go upstream and we care for the kids before they ever enter into those issues? What would the stats in the Bay Area look like if in 15 years from now, 20 years from now, what would the stats look like if every single child that came into foster care today was immediately placed into a loving, stable home? That's our dream. We want to see a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of kids in need of a home. In Cornerstone Fellowship, my hope is that God might be stirring in your heart to be a part of that in some way. So in just a minute, I'm going to share with you a couple of ways that you could take a step to get involved, or you could at least explore what it might look like for your family to move towards the vulnerable. Before we do that, I want to invite you to watch a quick story. I want you to be able to hear from a person whose life was impacted by those who moved towards him while they were in foster care. Watch this with me.
Statistically, I'm supposed to be dead, in jail, or homeless. Now, I'm not exaggerating. These are the grim odds that I faced growing up as a kid in foster care. You see, kids in foster care are almost 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. Close to 90% of kids that have been in 5 or more foster homes will encounter the juvenile justice system before they turn 18. And roughly 30% of foster kids end up homeless. So I'm not exaggerating. Statistically, I was supposed to be dead, in jail, or homeless. Yet obviously, here I am. Why? All because of one caring adult. Let me tell you a little bit about Rodney. See, I spent 3 years trying to get kicked out of Rodney's foster home. Because what hurting kids like me don't talk out, they will often act out. Now, my most notable stunt, and I know this was stupid, I opened up a checking account. I had about $100 in there. But then I proceeded to write north of $10,000 worth of fraudulent checks. I actually got picked up by the police for that idiotic stunt. But what Rodney did was life-changing. After allowing me to spend the night in jail so that hopefully I would learn from my foolishness, he bailed me out the next morning. And I thought for sure that was it. That was the moment this guy was going to get rid of me, wash his hands of me, give up on me, walk out on me, just like adult after adult after adult in my life had. But Rodney sat me down. He said, Josh, you can keep causing problems, acting up, acting out. But you've got to realize, son, we don't see you as a problem. We see you as an opportunity. You see, Rodney didn't see what was on the surface, right? This foster kid who was a troublemaker, this kid who some would call a lost cause. Rodney saw the opportunity. And that moment was my turning point, from becoming an inevitable statistic to who I am today, all because of one caring adult. You see, every kid is one caring adult away from being a success story. So let's be frank with each other. You could be the very reason that a kid like me doesn't end up a statistic. Foster the City is focused on providing a loving home for every kid in the foster care system. Now, they do this in two distinct ways. Number one, by recruiting foster parents. And way number two is by recruiting individuals to support these foster parents. Look, because of Rodney, no exaggeration, my life was drastically, forever changed. And with Foster the City's unique approach, all of us can be a Rodney, either as a foster parent or as a member of that support team for the foster parents. So whichever option you feel called to do, you could be that one caring adult that changes a kid's life forever. So to take your next step and to learn more, check out fosterthecity.org.
As Josh said, there are a couple of key ways that you could get involved. One is to actually become a foster parent. You could actually explore what it might look like for your family to open up your heart and your home to someone who's in need in your community. There is a profound need for more foster homes right here in the Bay Area and really across the country. That could be a step that you could explore what it might look like to become a foster parent. The reality is that's not for most of us. That's for maybe a handful of us. But I know that there are many of you out there watching today that are thinking, man, like this breaks my heart hearing that there are kids in my community, my neighborhoods that are in need. I'm not at a season of life where I can personally foster, but I can support a foster family. And we've created a role we call a support friend for a foster parent. And let me tell you why. You know, nationwide, there have been studies done, and they say that only about 40% of families that are fostering will make it past their first year. You hear that? It's like within year one, only about 40% of families that are fostering will keep going because it's really hard because of all the things we've already discussed today. What changes that retention is if a foster family takes their journey in the context of community, if they have support that have been covenanted to them. So this is not a support friend. A support friend is not somebody who says, oh, great, you're fostering. Give me a call if you need something sometime. That's a well-intentioned friend. That's not a support friend, okay? Because that well-intentioned friend will never hear from that foster parent because none of us like to ask for help. A support friend is somebody who has covenanted themselves to that family throughout their fostering journey. And so a support friend is somebody who provides practical, emotional, spiritual support to that family throughout their placement. So a support friend is somebody who says, man, I can't foster, but I can bring a meal. I can babysit so those parents can go out and get a date night and keep their marriage strong. I can come show up and do yard work. I can help to provide additional capacity so those families can help foster those kids longer and stronger. Maybe that's a role that you could consider. If you're interested in learning more about that role of a foster parent or a support friend for a foster parent, your next step is the same. It's simply to go to fosterthecity.org. I want to invite you to go to our website, fosterthecity.org, and register for one of our upcoming interest meetings. These are free informational meetings. There's no money involved. There's no commitments involved. It's just a time to go and explore. We've got them happening all over in person in the Bay Area, but we also have them virtually. So really you can just log on in your pajamas at home. And you can just spend about an hour or so learning about these two roles and a couple of other roles that you could play with Foster the City. I want to encourage you, visit fosterthecity.org. Now, let me wrap up with this. As I said, foster care is not for everybody. That's just one expression of remarkable compassion. The question that I want to leave you with today is this. Am I living a life of remarkable compassion? Because that's what God is calling you to. That's what he's calling me to. I told you what the word compassion means at the outset of our time together. Let me finish by telling you what the word remarkable means. Remarkable, it's really simple. It's just remark-able. In other words, you're able to remark on it. In other words, it's worth talking about. The question is, am I living a life of compassion that's worth talking about? So the other day I went to San Diego, flew back. My wife asked me how the flight was. I said, it's fine. In other words, it wasn't remarkably bad. It wasn't remarkably good. It just wasn't worth talking about. It was fine. That's not the kind of life that we were meant to live. Fine. We were meant to live a life of compassion that was worth talking about. And that's straight from the mouth of Jesus. Matthew 5, Jesus says, let your light shine before others that they might see your good deeds and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Are you living a life of compassion that when the watching world looks into your life and they see the way that you spend your time and the way that you're holding your relationships, and they see the way that you're using your resources and your gifts, when they see the way that you are spending the few fleeting moments that we have on this planet, guys, it goes so fast. When the watching world sees the way that you are spending the few fleeting moments you have on this planet, does it cause them to respond? Does it cause them to remark? Does it ultimately cause them to give glory to your Father who's in heaven? That's the life that we're called to. Let me pray for us. God, I thank you and I praise you for every person that's joined us today. God, I thank you for Cornerstone Fellowship and for years and years of remarkable compassion towards this Bay Area community and really beyond. God, I pray for more. I pray that this area would never be the same as a result of what you're doing in and through Cornerstone Fellowship in this generation. God, I pray for every person that's joined us today, that you would stir in their hearts, that you would give both clarity and courage, that you give us clarity to know how you're calling us to move forward in our lives of compassion and the courage to follow you in that leadership. God, we love you, we thank you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless.
In our attempts to really bring the kingdom of God to our communities, to our neighbors, to our neighborhoods, to pull down the kingdom of God, we also partner with organizations that are really good at putting into practice the things that we want to do in modeling and following after Jesus. So I've got with me here Philip Pattison. Philip, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for bringing the message this weekend. And we're spending a whole hour talking about foster care. You started an organization called Foster the City. What is your personal connection with foster care? And if I may ask.
Yeah, so foster care is something that's always been a part of my life. So we, growing up, my parents fostered. So we had brothers and sisters coming in and out of the home. So actually we're third generation foster parents, my wife and me. So my parents fostered and their parents fostered. And so it just was something that we experienced growing up. And I've said this often, the reality is, like, honestly, some of the more difficult, challenging moments of my childhood actually were a direct result of being a foster brother, right? Having kids coming out of the home. There were some pretty significant challenges along the way. But for every difficult moment, there were about 99 other moments where I watched my parents just persevere in love and compassion, just faithfully grind for these kids that were coming into our home. And it inspired me. And at one point, I just said, man, that is going to be part of my story someday. That's the kind of life that I want to lead. And so it took us about a decade of being married, but my wife and I took that step together. We became foster parents. Then we invited our church in, then other churches joined, and now this faith alliance is now Foster the City.
That's really cool, and I really do like that whole world that you build around parents. If you're watching this and you're like, I don't know if I could ever step into being a foster parent, but perhaps I can be part of the support circle, or I can help financially with this organization. It's so outside of what we're used to as Americans or Westerners, where we like to just stay on our own and we like to protect our privacy and protect our homes. Does this still fit? Do you feel like, you seem very hopeful, but it seems daunting to me, honestly.
Yeah, honestly, this invitation to foster care is kind of the antithesis to the individualistic culture that we live in, and even honestly is kind of an extreme invitation. We, oftentimes, being in ministry for a long time, like some of our favorite ministries are the kind where you invite people in and you go build a playground or you go clean a park or something, and then you take pictures and you high five and you say we did it, and we all go home, right? It feels really good. This is not that. The invitation is to welcome in a child from a hard place or children from hard places, and then turn your life upside down. And for 24/7, day in and day out, invest in compassion. And then if all goes well, after they become a part of your family and you've grown attached to them, you've cared for them as if they're your own flesh and blood, they go back home to go be with their family, and your heart gets ripped out. So if all goes well, it ends in grief. That's the invitation. And yet it's laying down your life, not because of what you're going to get out of it, but because we have the privilege of self-giving love towards others in need. And again, it's not a picture of the individualistic culture, but it's a picture of the gospel, because that's what he did for us.
And it makes us wholer. I don't know. It makes us more whole. It makes us really understand Christ better if we join in his suffering. This is not like that. We're not getting crucified here. But tell me something that you may have seen in families that have stepped into this remarkable compassion, and it changes things. It changes things for the foster children. I'm sure it does. Does it also change families or individuals?
So you're right, it's not crucifixion, but it can be hard, and God can bring beautiful things from it. And that's how I can tell you one story. So I'll tell you a personal story. One of the kiddos we brought into our home, beautiful little girl, 7 years old. She came in, brought lots of life and joy and laughter into our home. But she also had gone through some pretty significant things in her young life. And so she came in and had a lot of needs. And time and again, my wife and I thought, man, we don't have what it takes to care for her. We must not have heard the Lord right on this one. That's what we said. We must not have heard the Lord right. We just feel like we're failing her, this beautiful little girl who deserves so much. We just felt like we were failing her. And it was about 7 months we had her in our home. And it was just one of the most honestly difficult seasons of our life, hands down, because we just didn't feel like we had what it took. And she ended up leaving our home, and we just honestly felt like utter failures. And here I am, I'm leading Foster the City. Right. And I'm calling others to do it, and I feel like I can't even do it in my own home. But we had some support friends. And there was this one day when this little girl was in our home, and part of foster care, you keep the kiddos connected to their biological families. And so at one point we brought this little girl to a visit with her mom. So we drop her off for 2 hours. The rest of my family drives down the street to go have dinner. And then we're gonna come back and pick her up. So we eat at this restaurant, come out, somebody had slashed our tires. No idea who it was, but we were like, shoot, we have to go get our little girl. And so we called one of our support friends, and we say, is there any way you could drop everything you're doing, go down and pick up this little girl from her visit with her mom? Our friend happened to be a social worker as well. And so we said, could you go pick her up? She said, no problem. She drove down to pick up this little girl from her visit. And while she was there, she got into a conversation with the biological mom. And what sparked there was a friendship. And so even after this little girl left her home, ended up going back home to be with her mom, this friendship between our support friend and this biological mom continued. And our support friend invited this biological mom, saying, hey, you guys are back together as a family. You guys need a source of community, a source of love. You should consider coming and attending our church. I think you could find a great source of community there. And she said yes. And so she came and she brought that little girl and the rest of her siblings to our church community. And for the last 6 years, she's been a part of our church. Wow. After a couple of years, this biological mom placed her faith in Jesus. We got to watch her be baptized. And then it was a year ago this month that I got a note from the biological mom. It's not saying her name just for confidentiality, but she reached out and said, Philip, guess what? Our little girl, this little girl we fostered, she's placed her faith in Jesus. She's 12 years old now. She's placed her faith in Jesus, and she's quoting scripture at me saying, I need to be baptized, and we wanted to know if you'd be the one to do it. So last year we got a chance to baptize this beautiful little girl that had come into our home scared and hurting and alone and wounded, and now I was baptizing her as my sister in Christ. Yep. And seeing her family experience the love and the community that they needed to be able to rebuild their family's life. Again, looking at what we saw as absolute, utter failure. That we had completely failed this little girl. God used that difficulty and that challenge and our support friends to actually transform, not just provide love and stability for a little girl for a season, but for her family now to enter into the kingdom of God.
Wow. I love that. If that doesn't make you go, I need to know more. So here's information right here on the screen for you to maybe come visit one of those informational meetings or join online for one of them. If there's anything that we learn, and we talk about this all the time, is that it is only through trials and through pain and through hard things that our faith and our maturity grows. And so this would be a good way for you to invite some of those difficulties perhaps, but also some incredible joys. So be praying for Foster the City. I'm so glad you were here. I hope to see you next time.